Hey, welcome to Mornings with Meep, and now I'm going to be reviewing some of the books that I've read summer of 2019, um, going July, August, September even. So I'm going to start with The Alchemist. I don't know how to say the author's name, Paulo Coelho. I didn't have much to say about this when I did my own review. A very sweet fable, good audiobook, very short, perfect for the summer. I still agree with that. I do just want to talk about how I rate books on Goodreads in case you follow me, add me or whatever. You shouldn't necessarily go by my ratings. 3 to me is a solid book. It's okay. Um, 4 is a really good book. By the way, to make a 3, it actually has to be a pretty good book. For 4, that's what most people would give a 5 to. So I tend to do a little grade slide down compared to most people. In the 5-star, I tend to. Now, in a couple cases, I'm giving 5 stars to books I've been asked to review. Um, and they might not have very many reviews, so I try to use a standard other people use. But when it's something that has hundreds of reviews and that kind of thing, it's better to look at my words of what I say about it than the number of stars I give it. So it is a cute book. It is very short. I did it as an audiobook. Jeremy Irons was very good, of course, he's good. Um, and another comment about audiobooks with regards to narrators, that there can be a wide variety of audiobook quality. So when I rate stuff, I will often have the rating based not just on the content of the book, but how good the audiobook was. In some cases, the book would have been solid, the audiobook is awful. And usually that happens when the author of the book is the narrator of the audiobook. Very few authors really should do that. Most of them do not know what they're doing with regards to narrating an audiobook. They're good at the words. But the worst stuff I've seen, you never see this for fiction, really. It's for nonfiction books. And what's so bad is, while the author may be very knowledgeable about the topic in an academic sense, if you listen to them narrate the audiobook, all of a sudden you realize that they don't know how to pronounce any of the terms that they are writing about, because it's all been words on paper to them. It's not a lived experience. This is not necessarily important if it's a history or something like that. But the particular book I have in mind is Longitude. The author narrated the audiobook, and she could not, she did not know how to pronounce any naval terms properly. I was just like, it's like boatswain, forecastle. Anyway, I'm being kind of a snot with that. Some of them were even worse than that. That you don't know it's bosun or forecastle or whatever. That's okay. But in some of the cases, the pronunciation was so far off that, like, you should have just hired a proper professional audiobook reader. Anyway, it's a cute little book. It's kind of like a fable. People call it a mystical story, magical realism, and it's not really realistic. It's I would call it a fable or a parable. And that's all I'm going to say about that. The next one. Okay. So do we call this fanfic? What do you call this? There's a lot of Jane Austen fan fiction out there. And I guess the distinction between fan fiction and, I don't know, an homage or just continuation is whether someone will pay to read what you wrote. That's not necessarily the best distinction, but I might as well. Blake Smith has a variety of these Jane Austen continuations and other books that she's written. This one is kind of sweet. It follows Anne de Bourgh, which is Lady Catherine de Bourgh's daughter. She supposedly has poor health, and this is a sweet little story. She goes to Scarborough, and it kind of intersects with Pride and Prejudice. It's nice. There's a lot of just Pride and Prejudice, specifically variations, sequels. I have read. I've read a lot of different ones. I've got to say, the worst one I read was by someone who should have known better. Um, P.D. James, Death Comes to Pemberley, which I thought was an awful book. Um, I don't care what other people have to say about it. It was awful. Anyway, so Blake Smith, as you can see, I give it 3 stars. It just means it was a nice read. Um, if anything below 3 stars, I'm just like, it's no, because that's going to be the next one. This is something that I picked up at the library sale in North Salem. And for all I know, the guy who does this lives in North Salem. We get people like that. So at Investment Trivia 2019, Fred Fuld, evidently he does a book a year. I don't know when he started this. It's a bunch of just random trivia crap. And when I actually checked, it's a bathroom book of trivia, but it's not even that good. You might as well just go around Wikipedia. And I actually looked some of the stuff up, and it was just wrong. And in some of the cases, I didn't even have to look it up because this is the business I'm in. I'm like, no, that's not what that term means. It's just a junk book. Sorry, I'm wasting your time. So let's move on to something that's not a junk book. So let's go up here. TR's Last War. So that's, of course, Teddy Roosevelt. The Great War, which is World War I, and a journey of triumph and tragedy. So David Petrushka, or however he says his name. I'm sorry, I don't. People get on about, you're Anglo-centric, whatever. Well, I know the name Campbell. All of these Eastern European names, I have no idea. Sorry. The Polish names, the Slovak, Czech, whatever. I'm just going to approximate it. Anyway, this guy is a historian. He's written a lot of books on Teddy Roosevelt and some other people. This was an interesting one. I did this as an audio book, but it's an interesting historical book. I'm going to actually just read my review out loud for a variety of reasons. So this is a book on Teddy Roosevelt's last years. It gives one much to ponder about current politics. So this book focuses primarily on the run-up to America's entry into World War I, and that's Teddy Roosevelt wants the U.S. to at least be prepared militarily to enter, even if they didn't want to enter yet. It shows the 1916 presidential election, so think over 100 years ago, as well as the congressional elections of 1914 and 1918, which Teddy Roosevelt was very active in. Many of the names that are in the book were very prominent in politics then, but they're forgotten now except for historians. So that should give you some perspective on what people 100 years from now will remember about politics in our time. Even the presidents will be forgotten except as names on a list. Think about that. Even things that loomed large back then, so tariffs were really big. This was more tariffs on raw material coming from the U.S., like cotton, not manufactured goods like today. So these keep coming back. Some of the issues that were really big back then have fallen by the wayside. One of the items that keeps coming back, and this was very important during World War I, was Teddy Roosevelt's rants about hyphenated Americans. So before you think about what that would mean now, what he was referring to then were specifically German Americans and Irish Americans. So these are groups that are uncontroversial in the U.S. now, because at this point they are many generations. Most of the people who say they're Irish American or German American are many generations separated from the old country. So they don't really have any active connections to Germany or Ireland in any meaningful political sense. But obviously it had an effect in World War I. You might be wondering why Ireland? Well, it's because they hated the English. And so they didn't want to come in on the British side. Even though Ireland was still part of the UK at the time, you still had the IRA and other groups like that very active. So you might find that issue interesting when you have the distance of 100 plus years and what were important political issues then. maybe mutated now or just not important at all now, uh, should give you some perspective about politics now and think about what you think is important now and what will actually have been important 100 years from now. So, the problem with the book, I mentioned it jumped around in time. And of course, most of us are not very familiar with what was going on then. Given that he's jumping around in time, and maybe there were a bunch of names that I wasn't familiar with, uh, I kept losing the thread of what was happening when and what was cause and what was effect. That could have used work, but on the whole, it was a pretty good historical book. And then the last one, I'm not going to get into it very deeply, Witches Abroad by Terry Pratchett. So this is kind of, you could say it's second in the Witches series of Discworld. Terry Pratchett is kind of my go-to, I don't want to call it trash reading, but comfort reading. In the past, my comfort reading used to be Isaac Asimov, Larry Niven, Robert Heinlein, Agatha Christie, and Jane Austen, and Charles Dickens. Pratchett, within the last 5 years, has kind of come into my rotation. I like Discworld a lot. You could say these are fantasy books. It's not exactly a series either. They're all in the same universe, Discworld, and you have a lot of recurring characters. So one character that shows up in all the novels is Death. He's more and less important depending on the book. There's a Death series, but he always shows up, no matter how active he is. And then there's other ones that kind of come and go. You don't have to read the books in any particular order. So I was actually looking up recommended reading orders. So here is, let me see if I get up here. Yeah, so there's a bunch of books. I'm not even sure how complete this is. This is probably pretty complete. The problem is there's a whole bunch. You see this Science of Discworld. It says science novels, so I haven't even read these. So I don't even know if they're novels or if they're, actually, I'm not quite sure what they are. So the main ones are these yellow and orange novels, and it tells you like where to start in a series. But the thing is, Pratchett wrote these knowing that people might dip in the middle of a series. He does not require you to have a lot of context from prior books. Now, if you do know the prior books, you will catch references to other characters and other things, but you actually don't need to know them. A lot of people have recommended ones to read first. I don't have any specific one to recommend reading first. I really like the City Watch novels. So starting with Guards, Where That Begins is good. But a lot of these, so Men at Arms, Feet of Clay, actually most of these are basically police procedural mysteries, which is kind of interesting, though sometimes there's other things going on, but generally there's mysteries. There are the death novels, as I mentioned. There's ones that kind of sit on their own, Pyramids, Small Gods. So here's History Monks. There's the witches novels. Again, you don't have to read them in order, but there's certain relationships that develop over that quote series. I don't really like the Rincewind novels. Rincewind is kind of a pain in the butt as a character. My favorite character, though, is Moist Von Lipwig in Going Postal, and there's a really good I don't know what to call it, miniseries, but maybe two-parter that you can watch on Amazon Prime, and it's available for free in other streaming video services. So, there's other ways you can do it, different orders, but you know what? Go with what's available. There are often a lot of Discworld books available at libraries, and, just go pick one up. They're comic, they're kind of fantasy, but they're not high fantasy, they're not low fantasy either. It's got a veneer of fantasy magic, but it's actually just regular old comedy novels, in my opinion. That's my opinion. So those are my first set of 5.